Good morning, everyone. I'm Dennis Cochrane, the president of St. Thomas University. Au nom de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines, University of New Brunswick et de St. Thomas University, je veux vous remercier d'être ici ce matin. On behalf of the Federation, UNB and St. Thomas, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the session here this morning, particularly my pleasure to welcome you to the St. Thomas University campus. I'd also like to thank Mount Allison University, who sponsored this particular session this morning. Congress 2011 is well underway and going exceptionally well. After years of meetings and planning, I think the organizing committee have done a phenomenal job. One side benefit of that is it's caused two, not rival campuses, but two squabbling campuses to work together. And we've seen great cooperation as a result of Congress 2011 and the steering committee being made up from not only the Federation and its supporters, but also from UNB and St. Thomas. This morning's lecture is already the fifth in a series of big thinking lectures. They have been well attended, thought-provoking, and generating a lot of discussion. I know the trend will continue this morning, maybe even intensify. Following David's presentation, Federation President Graham Carr will moderate a question and answer session with the audience. Mesdames et Messieurs, c'est avec grand plaisir de vous présenter David Adams Richards. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce David Adams Richards to you this morning. David has received many national and international awards for his novels, essays, and screenplays. He is one of only 3 writers to earn the Governor General's Literary Award for fiction and nonfiction. He was nominated for a Governor General's Literary Award for 3 other novels and has won the Canadian Authors Association Award, the Alden Nowlan Award of Excellence in English Literary Arts, and the Randall Atlantic Fiction Award. Mercy Among the Children, a book the Washington Post called a masterpiece in the tradition of Tolstoy and Melville, won the Giller Prize. The Friends of Meager Fortune won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. His most recent work of nonfiction, God Is, was #1 in the Globe and Mail nonfiction religion bestseller list. His novel, Incidents in the Life of Marcus Paul, was published just 2 weeks ago. It has been hailed by critics as smart, stunning, and profound. A masterpiece and a classic tragedy telling politically incorrect truths. It is already a national bestseller. Regarding his new book, many reviewers use the common phrase, set in. Those who have a passing familiarity with his work understand that phrase means the location of Miramichi. Those who have an intimate understanding of his work understand the deeper interior geography and the universal dimension of his fiction. I think we are all interested in what David has to say about place because he has written about it so descriptively in his work and because he has explored it so deeply in each one of his characters and by extension, his readers. It seems strange for me to introduce David Adams Richards to our campus. He just served as the co-chair of our 100th anniversary celebrations. He's also the artist in residence here at St. Thomas. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the artist in residence at St. Thomas University, David Adams Richards.
I've got a bit of a cold. I've been on the road for the last month and a half with this new book, so I hope I can get through this. People ask me why I was so early in the morning. I said, there's got to be a lot bigger thinkers than me here. Usually at this time of the morning, I'm saying to Anton, do you want Cheerios or Rice Krispies? And he says, Cheerios. And I say, well, there's no Cheerios. How would you like Rice Krispies? So. Anyway, I'm going to talk about a sense of place and what it means to us as New Brunswickers or Miramichiers or Maritimers. And then I'm going to read a bit from The Friends of Meager Fortune, which is a novel that takes place 50 years ago when globalization started, actually, for us. Probably started before then, but that's the novel where I wrote about the mechanization of the forest and the loss of a certain kind of a way of life. and I think it's apropos to today. So I'll talk a bit about what I think Sense of Place has to do with my own experience. I'm not saying it has to do with anyone else's. And then I'll try to read a bit, and I hope my throat holds up. I might go for the water now and again, so I'm not rushing out the door if you see me leave the podium. So, I'm not really sure what the question was. I didn't quite get it, but I'll try to answer it. So, this, I think, is a two-part question. Firstly, what is a sense of place? And secondly, how will the new global reality change or destroy it? It is both an overlapping cultural and economic concern, which I have only a slight ability to answer. However, the answer to both these questions might be best found in my work. But to begin, I never knew I had a sense of place until people who reviewed books and lived in cities told me I did. I'm sure this was the case for other writers from here as well. I simply wanted to tell stories about the people I knew and grew up with. And I knew a great variety of people from all walks of life. But in telling these stories, it was assumed that these people came only from this place, which in a way categorized them as limited and not being able to cope with any other place. So for decades, the influence was not particularly generous. It was, as it was for others, artistically derogatory, sometimes artistically derogatory, and relying on a superior sense of cosmopolitanism. In fact, the Miramichi I wrote about was mocked as lacking that sophistication that many real writers strive for. Not that I haven't fought back against the supposition, which I saw as parochial and silly. But the supposition came because of what qualified as a sense of place. To have a sense of place often meant that one was restricted, in a way restricted. I think this is part of an inherent misconception that bothers today's question, that people who live where we would live wouldn't know what more successful people know about the world. Now that the world beyond us is concerned about globalization, it focuses its concern on the regions. However, I've traveled many places and have seen limitation less as a place but as a condition, and at times a troubling human condition on Bloor Street every bit as much as Station Street, which reverses the supposition and asks, does Montreal or Toronto writers have a sense of place? And if they do not, for it is never mentioned that they have, was that a good cause for dismissal? For some write books about a city never mentioned and a place they themselves do not seem to know that well. So were their own lives limited in the kind of 9-to-5 proxy that in itself was as debilitating and imitative of an outside world as anything maritime characters did or wished to do? I do not think this in any way is pandering to a local and mischievous conceit. But it does go to the heart of a brackish argument the Maritimes has inherited through 4 generations of fairly institutionalized condescension. I know that condescension has been changing in the last few years. We are traditional, others at the center of our land are not. But they embrace the grand traditions from other places as a record of fair-minded multiculturalism, and they should. But at some point deny their own regions as backwater and uncouth. I suppose my land and my characters were considered for many a year the same way Emily Bronte's characters were. It was even painfully amusing that at some phases, the same phrases were used by reviewers over a century apart. Cecil and Lee and Blood Ties were considered in one review foul humanity in the exact same way Catherine and Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights were, and perhaps for the same reason. To have faced this as a writer most of my life is to grasp the essential duplicity in the promoted anxiety of today's question. For it is an apprehension that is not at all relevant if our place does not matter, but if it does matter, much of the same concerns about the changing world, education and workforce, skilled and unskilled, the cultural tradition and dissemination of our way of life have already been explored by writers here to great effect. And this concern is as relevant to our place as, say, Cleveland with its broken factory floors, or 100 other small towns that have boarded its doors across the face of North America. A partial idea of art would be that you hold up a mirror to nature when the traditions are in place and a little life is sound and reasoned, where a kind of little house on the prairie respectability affords the reader a gentle slope into the story. But our traditions, like everyone's, have been in flux for years, And this sometimes withering sense of change is exactly what populates novels like Blood Ties or Lives of Short Duration. These works have a true idea of place, I think. Forgive me if I'm wrong. And this place is a great river. But all these novels are fired in a world of hurt and alarm, a world that can at times disintegrate before our very eyes, as harsh and burdensome and lovely as a torrent. A world that has faced globalization for years and years. And in each of these novels, the first written in 1974, the young do leave because they have to. This cultural and economic and social disadvantage is not new to us. Global interests are in fact at the doorstep buckled down with knives. And forgive me for saying this, but this concern drawn out since I was 24 is what at times has been superciliously dismissed. So globalization has come in fact to us before some others, and few have heard our cries. I again say that this is changing now. But it will come to others too, this moment where the past leaves us all. In many maritime books already written, the alarm is and should be felt. Our education has at points deceived us without intending to, and our industries are gone. In fact, the register of complaint can be traced. It happened in 1922 with the run-up on the lumber, in 1930 with the closure of the mill, in the late 1940s with the mechanization of the forest, in the 70s with the bust of the fisheries, 80 years of globalization. In Lives of Short Duration, written, my God, 30 years ago now, I spoke of it as the great unwholesome anonymity of North America. Some of it, so if some believe the onslaught of the New Age will destroy us, then we have not taken to heart what has already happened, how we have already weathered it in a way, how in fact in some respects we have overcome it. It is not nice and it is not new. In our education system, at times, teachers create teachers to tell us about our past while we struggle toward a future unaided. But my uncles, my brother and sister-in-law, some now going into their twilight years, did this as well. Still, we overcame it by one thing alone, our humanity. This, in my mind, is not popular literary sentiment, but radical truth. Writers with a sense of place have often been the more radical and forceful proponents of this greater humanity that comes and seems only to come from this true block and tackle hardship that we have felt for years. Thomas Hardy was that poor little fellow from Dorset, according to Henry James. True enough, he was. He was also, in his last 4 books, revolutionary. D.H. Lawrence was born near a coal shuttle, was reviled in his home as much as Joyce in the backwater of Dublin. 2 of the most revolutionary writers of the last century came from a backwater filled with bigotry and malice. Emily Dickinson, we remember, was laughed at for her terrible poems in Her Little Town. And in 1936, Faulkner's Absalom was considered by the New York Times the final blow-up of what was once an interesting, if minor, talent. The truth being that all these people lived in places the great world dismissed, passed by, and scorned. We do know that. So if you happen to look through maritime literature, you might see that globalization is hardly new. It, for all intents and purposes, has tried its damnedest to do us in, to plasticize our world and cover it over. And it has both physical and psychological dimensions. But our place, of course, is not the South or Cape Breton Island or the Miramichi or St. John or Fredericton or the coal mines of England, but the human heart. That is, if for our writers it was just a sense of place, there would never be any reason to pick up a pen. What if people leave, you ask, and the world changes? But my God, they have. The Miramichi has been eradicated of its young 3 times over. So in a real way, we have already experienced the future. A family tradition of going down the road, and sometimes, many times, coming home again. At the end of Blood Ties, Moffat and Irene, children gone to the great city, are left with a kettle boiling in an empty kitchen. Globalization has called their children away in the autumn of 1969. Yet Sidney Henderson reminds us in Mercy Among the Children, written 25 years later, that even on a patch of frozen soil, a solitary man is his own true nation and free as he chooses to be. No moment or comfort is ever secure no matter where we live, or future certain for any of us no matter where we live. How we respond to it, how we respond to this is up to us alone. Each one of us can choose to be free. The world in all its brag and fuss will never give us any guarantee but that. Thank you. And now I'm going to read from The Friends of Meager Fortune. It's about the mechanization of the forest. It's about a crew in the deep woods in the late 1940s. And two things are going on, which are pet peeves of mine. One is a scandal that involves Owen Jamieson, who runs the mill that the men are cutting for. And this scandal has caused a deterioration of the people up in the mountain cutting. They're pessimistic and they're not sure what's going to go happen. It also allows for another mill called Esterbrook's to come in and try to steal the Jamieson wood. And they do this by hiring a guy who works for Jamieson to use a stamp to stamp the wood that is cut for Esterbrook. He does this secretly. If he's caught, he'll certainly be killed. In these two small, short pieces I'm going to read, one is about the scandal, and one is about the guy who was stamping the wood with the wrong stamp. And both of them deal with a little guy named Meager Fortune, who is one of my favorite characters that I've managed to deal with. The year the chainsaws came in, about 1950. There were two-man chainsaws at the time. Well, I don't know if I can find the second part. I'll read the first part. The men would check the two sleds and make sure of the harness, and then as the days got cold and tedious, they wouldn't get back to the camp until midnight. They would fall into bed exhausted in their clothes, preparing to be up in 5 hours. They watched each other in wind and whiteout conditions, and often in the bone-chilling fog. They were like specters on that hill, the snow coming off their back in spray as they made their lunge, snow across their scarves and faces, so until you saw the horses, you could not tell one from the other. One lantern light to show that mankind still existed on the mountain. One beacon to call out that humanity in all its self-recriminations, falsity, and self-imposed foils was taking wood down to build houses in Europe, New York, Fredericton, or Halifax. Even though these men, would never be welcome in any of those places, nor could ever conceive of being so. On their right was a shale drop to the water that descended from a height of 223 feet at a slant of about 38 degrees. The turn at the bottom had to be made quickly, or a teamster chanced running his load into the dammed and frozen pond in front of him. Even the heaviest sled and the bravest horse were scuttled sideways because of the slickness of the ice, where no sand or chaff would hold, though the sand piles were kept heated at night under those desperate lanterns. The bridge was small, and the runners on the sleds had just enough space to make the cross. All of this with the teamster's hands frozen stiff and his back aching. One slip and you were over the bank, or not turning quickly enough into the dammed brook. And the harder you worked, the harder it got. But the men had reasoned it could be no other way down, and they could not construct the bridge anywhere else. And once these things were reasoned and done, and once the men began their harsh and frozen task, and once it was decided that the horses must do this, and to hear the horses grunt out in agony had to be, no one was going to change it. Missy was designated to lead, and since the other horses only seemed to feel safe when in sight of the Clydes, they came out the hill close behind. That is, they mimicked each other just as humans did. This was a fantastic gamble, for the Belgians came behind her so close into the turn that one snout was almost up against the rear pole. And when the snow blew thick, it was a gamble just to see over the trackless slope with tufts of forlorn alders and hard clots of dung, windswept as any plain on earth. Then at night, they looked at each other saying, "Don't you fail me up in front, or you keep her steady on my tail." Things were okay, though. They roared and laughed, threw objects at each other's heads, and were silent only at dinner. On the 64th night of the hall, Owen the boss was not in camp, and so the men were free to talk and gossip, for it echoed up from the town that something was happening. These rumors came with the portager and were fed with the mail. Tonight there was some talk of union, but most was talk about Owen having an affair with Reggie's wayward wife. "The husband's not even known to be alive or dead," Gravelier said, holding up a letter from his own wife. He read, holding his cigarette out and flicking the ashes into his turned-up cuff. "Fine piece of work this will end up being," he said. Then he would look down at the letter and shake his head. "They're looking for a body," he said, "the body of Reggie." And he shook his head again. "I'll body Camilla if she ever wiggles her bum at me," he said, looking up and winking so Tompkins and all the other men laughed. Many said they were sorry for Reggie, that he was a brave man. That is, their idea of who Reggie was had changed completely again in a week. "Well, that's what a woman can do to you," Colson said. Little Meager Fortune asked him to give it time and see if everything didn't just work out, for he had known what rumor and scandal could do. Then after a while, Meager made his way to the hovel to be alone. The snow whispered against the open front and hit him at his midsection. It was his birthday. He was now 27 years old. He remembered his funny, ill-fitting suit with the missing shirt button on the day he was married. He had not told anyone, for he kept those recipes in his boots to take home to his wife and child, that his wife and child had actually died in a house fire sometime in June 1944, and he could still not speak of them being gone. Still, to celebrate this mischief called a birthday, he had come to see the horses. He placed his hands up on Missy's back and listened to the wind whistle down through the wood, thinking and digesting all he had heard tonight about Camilla and Owen. His dark, rough hands were cut and chapped from the cold, his face almost as tough as leather, and still as childlike as innocence itself. He could be cut and bleed without knowing, and had been many times. He could stand cold that would kill many, and had once been caught up under the ice with a draft horse and survived. And he would, like his father, have arthritis in 10 years and be dead in 20. This is what the world offered him. He knew no other life, and in fact was frightened of it. This other life where men did not sweat or suffer the cold to half-frozen bodies. He had seen men prancing and preening at dances in a world he did not belong to, where they all somehow looked to him and moved in the way of women. He cringed to think it might be actually this way in cities and places he would never go. His life then was nothing. But he must stay and take care of the men. He knew that now. He was too kind to gossip, and he didn't like them talking about the boss Owen, so he came out here. He was a tiny man, too. He had a man who could lift 300 pounds on his back day in and day out. He looked at his leather gloves, his woolen jacket and thick woolen pants, and even here felt ashamed that he knew so little. You know, if he had known enough to read and write or enough to take a job on the railway, his wife would have lived. This is what he thought. He, through his splendid ignorance, had killed the woman he loved, though no one else would ever think this. He had cared for Missy as a filly. Now he moved the lantern forward and lighted it just enough to check her caramel-colored head and chestnut eyes. There were little flecks of hair missing along her back, small spots that the world had taken away from her. "Hello, lady, it's me, Meager Fortune. I knew Will, the great Will Jameson." An arm twisted him to a draw, way up at the camp on the Tabasson Tack. "I also saved a mule in the war." He set the lantern down and smiled without a tooth in his head. Butch's right hind leg had been scraped raw by a loose piece of hemlock he had dragged to the yard before he was harnessed to the two sled to haul over the bank to the river skids, which meant he and two of the Belgians were used all day long, working either down in the cut or on the two sled. It just meant that his great heart would give out a year or two sooner, and he wouldn't stop working until it did. As soon as he felt the log on the Devil's Mount, Butch would begin his ferocious stride up over a hill, cutting a swath through stumps and fallen wood that broke under his great strength, but took each day more strength from him, as if he was saying to the man handling the reins behind his back, "You want me to do this? Hook it on now, boy, and watch how I alone will work my way to death." Once, before the war, when the men were teasing a horse that would not work, Meager had tried to stop it. They had pushed him down and he had fallen on his back. He looked up and saw a graveler taking an axe to the horse's head. Meager remembers the horse gave a sad grunt and fell down. "That'll teach you, Baldur, son of a whore," Graveler said, as blood spotted his heavy, angry face and the peak of his cap. No, Meager had pleaded, but it did not matter if or when or how much he said no. So he went away and sat by himself in the woods. Meager Fortune knew there were many stories against Owen and Will Jameson, but he also knew who was kind to him and who would never take an axe to a horse. Poor old Butch, Fortune said now. However, the Teamsters were afraid of Butch. Sometimes Butch would work so hard the Teamsters could not back him up or stop him, and they would to a man marvel at his crazy lunges up the hill or fear him. "Get up out of that now, you crazy Jameson son of a whore," Nolan would yell, and Butch took it to his mind to do something on his own. And all of that wood, Meager thought. Where did it go? He had asked his wife Evelyn one night, and they had sat up late wondering about it, and neither of them were sure. So they went and asked his father Ned, and he wasn't sure either. Goes down river, don't it? Can't expect to know much more than that. Maybe it built houses, or maybe it went to offices and buildings in cities he would never see. Some said the Cedar Hall last year was used to make a sauna for a mob boss in New York. But wherever this great wood went, it came from these men. Meager Fortune knew that much. Gibbs had not tended to Butch's cut right, so Meager found a way to poultice the animal using balm out of the old tack box at the end of the hovel and some mud mixed with straw. Butch stood in docile acceptance while Meager worked, sure that his own great and towering strength given to him by the great horse Byron's Law and his mother Missy had sealed his fate to run these logs up the hundreds of yards through the stump-laden snow-scowled cut, and then down over the morbidly freezing mountain, slabs of ice that looked in the shimmer of distance like pale blue rock. Knowing this, Meager whispered, "You take them down the slope, Butchie boy. No one can do it but you. You have to do it now." Butch stood furious and rigid, as if his plan, caught in the sinew of his blood and brain, was to kill a man before he took himself. Of course, that was giving human emotion to a beast, and Meager knew them so well as never to do that. Then Missy dropped her head to the little feed box, her breathing scattering a few cold oats before her. And this allowed little Meager Fortune a profound realization That Missy's years of work, years of being fed too much or too little, run too hard, brought to her feet with laudanum and morphine, had made her now forget him. No longer was she the filly with the big clown shoes. Her massive strength had made her into something else entirely. An animal of such magnificent power, she looked upon the universe of man with indifference. Her existence now was one of brutal work or death, and in the end, both. Meager patted her head and smiled, but now Missy only stared into nothing. And this is about Tompkins, who was hired to use the Estabrook stamp on the Jameson logs. And what happens is, in the spring runoff years ago, they put them into a big circular boom. And you had your marker, your stamp on your logs, and you separated them in that boom. But if all these logs are stamped with the Estabrook stamp and not the Jameson one, then the Jameson's wood won't be there. And so the men essentially will be working 6 months for nothing. And Tompkins is doing this because he's mad at the Jamesons. And he has his bonus, which is the money Estabrook gave him, in his pocket. So this will be over quick, I promise. The sky was low, and all day a breeze warmed Tompkins' face, making him open his coat and stretch into the sun. He stayed out almost an hour after the last of the two sleds went back up the hill, stamping logs with the Estabrook stamp. There was a smell of tin in the air, prevalent close to the night, and the dreary sound of the wind against his parka like snow scattering on tar paper. It was about 4 when the wind started to turn cool, and Tompkins hid the peavey with the Estabrook stamp, picked up the Jameson one, and started toward his camp. He was hungry and lonely and heading toward home along the skid road. The sky had darkened, and Tompkins was miles from anywhere, in a sad, empty place unknown by 99% of humanity. The cold now seeped through his jacket lining where he kept his money. He had been going to pick up a ride with the last two sled, but the two sled roared by in a whiff of winter horse and a cloud of snow while he was doing his business in the woods. He had run out to call them, but had tripped, and the old horses were gone. There would be another two sled along, Curtis's, but not for 2 or 3 hours. Well after dark, Curtis would make his way back with a lantern light up near the horse's foreshoulder, dangling on a peculiar makeshift rod. It was a way to tell Curtis from all the others. But Tompkins, looking behind him into the desolate emptying of the day, saw nothing. He worried about panthers, for they were still here in these great lost woods. His boots were soaking, his fingers were raw. He turned and began to walk on boots almost frozen toward the camp miles away. He zippered his coat as tight as he could and pulled his hat down tighter upon his balding head. He remembered all the stings against him, many given him by his father, and tried his best to forget them as he walked. This is why Stretch Tompkins always made fun of others who he deemed inadequate, because his father had made so much fun of him. That is why he called them little men and pipsqueaks, for he himself felt so little in his soul. As he walked along the brook road, he realized he had never been in the dark before without someone else to show him the way. And after a while, worry crowded his senses, and he began to think he was no longer on the path. He might be in the middle of a field of jack pine going in the other direction, and if that was the case, he might stumble over the second cliff that ran down from Good Friday Mount into the back of Aaron Brook proper. He would be lost in the maze of jack pine in a second. He lighted a match to look, but the match went out in the wind, and at any rate showed only his fingers. It was now pitch dark. He began to call and stumble forward. "Daddy," he called. And when he stopped, his voice echoed about him, above him, behind him, and then the wind began to moan in the trees. He felt he couldn't make it back to the camp, And with this in mind, he began climbing the snow with his gloved hand to burrow a tunnel away from the wind, for now all he wanted to do was to get out of the wind. He dug over 2 feet of dry, hard snow and slipped down under it, looking up at the sky. He then searched for something to burn, but there was nothing, only what was left of his money in his pocket. He sat with his knees up shivering, and in a while there was deathly silence. The wind had stopped, except for the occasional bluster from across the long field. Tompkins knew by the taste of the air, and the temperature was about to drop below -30 or -35. It had been so warm that day that he had sweated, and he enjoyed the sweat on his back. Now his body felt like ice. He would be dead within 2 hours. He could not burn his money. Burning his money would be worse than death. Why had he ever come here? He put his money in a little pile in the snow, picked out his last match, and looked at it. The snow burned his hands. It was so cold when he piled the money up. Here, surrounded by 1 billion tons of wood, Stretch Tompkins was about to burn his money, his wide face and wider mouth in a kind of carpish, sad grin. But then, Mr. Tompkins, he heard. Tompkins, for Jameson, Tompkins. He paused, but then he heard it again. Far, far away, but coming closer. He waited, and then it was unmistakable, like an angel, though Tompkins did not believe in angels. I'm here, he roared, grabbing his money. I'm here, good God, I'm here. He stuffed his money into his pockets with fingers so numb he could not feel them. Who was here to search for him? Who would it be? Who would have come to find him, if anyone? He waited 10 long and then 15 long minutes. And then, walking out of the dark, he saw the tiny, eager, smiling face of Meagher Fortune. When Tompkins had not arrived in the 2-sled, Meagher said they had set out searching. Who? Half the camp? Really? For me? Sure, of course. That was not true at all. Most of them simply believed a man should take care of himself. Meagher was the only one who had worried. I'll give you money here, money for finding me, Tompkins said. I don't want your money. And don't parade money, or they will get you into a cart. Oh, who will? Them boys are the ones who play cards, Meagher said. So Tompkins stuffed his money away again. Now Meagher had to force him to walk, and so told him of all the times he had been sick just to keep Tompkins moving. Of once when he fell down a chute into a dam of water with his parka on. They had to lift him out by a crane, a line hooked to his back. And when he was cranked out, he was frozen stiff, like an abominable snowman. But he told Tompkins, not only did he not get sick, but his cigarettes didn't even get wet. Why? Well, because all his other clothes had frozen solid and left him as snug as a bug inside the ice. And the only thing he could move as they took him to the stove to thaw him out was his eyes. But that wasn't all, he said. Why, he lived in a house where the space between the boards allowed you to see the traffic going by on the street, so he could tell who had new cars. Try that on for size if you don't think it's cold, he said. And besides that, he had to wake up every morning and shovel snow out of his bedroom window because every night he would have a drift come in. Besides that, the rats would run over the bed in 2s and 3s, and he would play a game where he would grab them by the tail and toss them out the window. But then again, try an outhouse in January. Well, of course, you have tried that, I know. I've seen you in an outhouse many times. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Tompkins. It's just our humanity. Then he told Tompkins about his family, his little boy Duncan and his wife Evelyn. And he told him the secret he had told no one else except Missy and Butch that night. That is, that Evelyn and his little boy Duncan had died in a fire when he was in Europe. They had died on June 5th, 1944. I miss them, he said, and he coughed. Isn't that then a nice name, Evelyn? I think it's the finest name in the whole world. I was in Europe. It was June 6th. I had not heard they had died, you know. We were pinned down just off the beach. The Germans were throwing those potato mashers on us. And I got caught, a potato masher gets caught in my jacket, honest to God, and there I'm thinking I'm done for, even more than the time I froze solid. Yet out of the blue, this lad comes up, takes the masher and throws it in the air and jumps on me. So I'm saved, Mr. Tompkins. And I said to the lad, "What's your name, son?" And he looked at me with the finest eyes and kindest smile I ever knew and said, "Sir, my name is Evelyn." And I never saw him before or after that day. Here, I almost forgot, I have some soup. I made it myself. I'm becoming nothing if not sort of a half-starved cook. Tompkins drank the soup and kept saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," whenever Meagher told another story. Meagher kept talking and kept saying, "Come, Mr. Tompkins, come, come." I only wanted my daddy to be proud of me. He was so tough, I never measured up, Stretch said. "Well, what nonsense," Meagher answered. "I know your father. You just keep walking and we'll get home and your dad will be proud of you. You don't think he is? Well, I will tell you, yes, yes, yes. He always says he is when you're not there." They hobbled disjointedly down the road, one voice of humanity to the other, both making echoes into the void. Thank you.